There is something about a church that bypasses the rational mind entirely. You can be a person of complete skepticism, someone who has questioned every institution, every authority, every claim that cannot be verified, and still feel it when you walk through those doors. The smell of old wood and candle wax, the particular quality of light through stained glass, colored and diffused and somehow gentler than ordinary light. The silence that is not empty but full, weighted with the accumulated prayers of everyone who stood in that space before you and brought their heaviest things and set them down. We go to these places because we need to believe that something is listening, that our suffering is witnessed, that the person on the other side of the confessional screen carries the authority of something greater than themselves, and that what we hand them in those dark, close quarters, our guilt, our grief, our secrets, will be held with care. Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to realize they were wearing a mask? Today I want to tell you the story of St. Mary's Church in a quiet town in rural Pennsylvania, and of a priest named Father Mark, and of everything that was buried, literally and figuratively, within those consecrated walls before the truth finally surfaced. This is not a story about faith, or rather, it is not a story that diminishes faith. It is a story about what happens when a predator understands that faith makes people vulnerable and decides to use that vulnerability as a weapon. Let's begin with Emily. Emily Hargrove was 34 years old when this story begins, in the autumn of 2019. She had been married to John for 9 years. John was a decorated former Marine, 2 tours, a chest full of commendations, the particular combination of discipline and protectiveness that military service either builds or breaks in a man, and in John's case had built into something genuine and solid. He worked in private security now. Long hours, irregular schedules, the kind of work that paid well enough to keep Emily at home with their 2 children, but extracted a price and presence that neither of them had fully anticipated when they chose this arrangement. Emily loved her children. This is not a small thing to say, and it is not a thing that needs to be qualified. She was a devoted mother who had organized her entire daily existence around the well-being of 2 small people who needed her in the total, consuming way that small children need their primary parent. She was good at it. The house ran, the children were happy, the routines held. But there is a difference between being needed and being known, between being essential to a household's functioning and being seen as a person, as a specific individual adult with thoughts and questions and an inner life that extends beyond the scheduling of school pickups and pediatric appointments. Emily had been needed for 9 years. She was not sure by the autumn of 2019 when she had last been truly known. John was not a cruel man. He was an absent one, which is a different problem and in some ways a harder one to name, because absence does not announce itself. It accumulates. It shows up in the dinners that happen in near silence, in the evenings when 2 people sit in the same room and are not in the same room at all, in the slow erosion of the feeling that you have a partner in this life, rather than a co-administrator of a shared logistical project. Emily had stopped trying to name it. She simply felt it, the way you feel a draft from a window that hasn't been properly sealed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently, at the edges, in the quiet hours. She turned to St. Mary's the way people turn to things that promise warmth when they have been cold for a long time. Not with any specific spiritual crisis, not with a dramatic conversion or a sudden revelation. She simply walked through the doors one Tuesday morning in October, sat in the 3rd pew from the back, and stayed for an hour. The silence held her. The light came through the windows the way she remembered it from childhood. She went back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. Father Mark had been assigned to St. Mary's 6 months earlier, transferred from a diocese in Ohio under circumstances that the church had described internally as an administrative reassignment, and that would later be understood as something else entirely. He was 41 years old. He was, by the accounts of virtually everyone who encountered him, magnetic in the specific way of people who have mastered the art of making whoever they are speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. He was tall and lean, with the kind of face that photographs well, and an attentiveness in conversation that people found, almost universally, irresistible. He noticed Emily on her third visit. He introduced himself after the service with the easy warmth that was his most practiced tool. He asked her name, asked about her family, listened to her answers with a quality of attention that was, in its contrast to the ambient inattention of her daily life, almost physically startling. He suggested that if she was finding the transition back to church after some years away to be something she wanted to explore further, he offered spiritual counseling to parishioners on Wednesday afternoons. The door was always open, he said. His role was to listen. She came the following Wednesday. What Father Mark offered Emily in those early sessions was not seduction. It is important to understand this because the mechanics of what he did were more sophisticated than simple seduction, and understanding them matters. What he offered, first, was witness. He asked her questions about her life that no one had asked her in years. He listened to her answers without redirecting the conversation toward himself, without checking a phone, without the subtle, constant signals that the people in our daily lives often emit that communicate, however unintentionally, that our experience is not quite interesting enough to hold their full attention. He was entirely, completely present. For a woman who had been functionally invisible inside her own marriage for the better part of a decade, this was not a small thing. It was, in the specific emotional context of her life, enormous. And Father Mark knew exactly what he was doing. He had done it before, in other parishes, with other women. The patient cultivation of trust, the slow escalation of intimacy disguised as pastoral care, the careful management of a person's emotional dependency, until the moment arrived when the dependency he had created could be converted into something that served his own purposes. By December of 2019, the Wednesday sessions had extended well beyond the hour he nominally allotted. By February of 2020, what was happening in the small office behind the sacristy had moved beyond anything that could be described as spiritual counseling. Emily would tell herself, in the months that followed, that she had not understood what was happening until it was already happening. And there is truth in that. Predators who operate as Father Mark operated do not announce their intentions. They create conditions. They engineer situations. They make the next step feel like something that simply happened, like weather, like the natural conclusion of a sequence that had its own logic and its own momentum. But I also want to say clearly that whatever Emily experienced and however she was manipulated, the choices made in that church were not equivalent. Father Mark was not a lonely person who made a mistake. He was a predator who had made the same mistake by then in at least 3 other parishes, whose transfer to St. Mary's had been the diocese's solution to a pattern of behavior they had chosen not to report to civil authorities, whose entire presence at St. Mary's was premised on a lie about who he was and what he intended. Emily was his victim before she was anything else in this story. The trouble with David Marsh began in March of 2020. David was a longtime parishioner at St. Mary's, 53 years old, a widower, a man who had been attending services at that church for nearly 2 decades, and who knew its rhythms and its spaces the way you know a place that has been the fixed point of your weekly life for a very long time. He had noticed things, small things at first. The way Father Mark positioned himself in relation to Emily after services, the particular quality of attention he paid her that was different from how he engaged with other parishioners, the length of time Emily's car remained in the parking lot on Wednesday afternoons, long after any counseling session should have concluded. He did not go looking for confirmation. He went to the confessional on a Saturday evening in late March, as he did most Saturday evenings, and what he found when he approached was not what he expected. He saw them through the partially open door. It lasted only a moment. He stepped back immediately, moved away from the confessional, stood in the nave of the church with the particular nausea of someone who has seen something they cannot unsee and does not yet know what to do with it. He was a man of deep faith. He was also a man who understood the magnitude of what he had witnessed, and what it meant about the person standing at the front of the congregation every Sunday morning. He approached Father Mark 2 days later. He was not aggressive about it. He was not a confrontational man by nature. He told the priest simply and directly what he had seen, and he said that he believed the bishop needed to be informed. Have you ever watched something beautiful reveal itself to be rotten at the center? That is what David Marsh saw in Father Mark's face in the moment after those words were spoken. The warmth, the practiced, deployed, entirely instrumental warmth that the priest carried like a professional tool, left his expression completely. What replaced it was something that David would not have had words for in the moment, but that the investigation would later describe, based on David's conversations with his sister in the days before his death, as terrifying. Father Mark told David to give him a few days to think about the right way to handle the situation. He said he wanted to speak with Emily first, to ensure she was protected from any unnecessary exposure. He was reasonable. He was measured. He gave no indication whatsoever of what he was already planning. He contacted David 4 days later and asked to meet him at the church that evening. He said he wanted to pray together, to seek guidance, to approach what came next in the spirit of the faith they shared. David agreed. He was a man of faith in a place of worship, invited by his priest. He had no reason not to. The bell tower at St. Mary's was accessed through a narrow door at the back of the choir loft, up a wooden staircase that turned twice before opening onto the ringing chamber, where 4 large bells hung in their frames, and above that, through a trapdoor, a small observation platform that looked out over the entire town. The tower was not generally accessible to parishioners. Father Mark had a key. Imagine standing in the darkness at the top of that tower, the cold of a Pennsylvania night in late March, the bells enormous and still in their frames around you. The town spread out below, every lit window a life you cannot reach, and next to you, someone you came to in trust, someone who wears the symbols of the faith you have held your entire life, and in whose hands, in that moment, your life is. David Marsh fell from the bell tower of St. Mary's Church on the night of March 29, 2020. The fall was not survivable. Father Mark descended the stairs alone, left the church through the side door, and returned to the rectory. In the days that followed, he reported David's absence to the congregation with an expression of concern that multiple parishioners later described, in retrospect, as flawless. The assumption was that David, a widower with no local family, had perhaps traveled or was dealing with a health matter. The body was not found in the basement of the church, where Father Mark had moved it with the methodical composure of a man who had already crossed a line so significant that what came after it required only logistics, until months later, in the context of an investigation that had not yet begun. Because in the interim, life at St. Mary's continued. Mass was celebrated, confessions were heard, the congregation gathered and dispersed and gathered again, and Father Mark stood at the altar Sunday after Sunday, his hands extended in blessing over a community that trusted him completely, while David Marsh lay in the basement of the building they were all sitting in. By the summer of 2020, John Hargrove had noticed a change in his wife that he could not precisely name. Emily had always been the kind of person whose emotional state was legible to him. He had been a Marine, he was trained to read people, and 9 years of marriage had given him a specific familiarity with her particular variations of mood and affect. What he was reading now was something he had no reference point for. A distraction that was different from ordinary distraction. An absence that felt directed, as though she was not simply elsewhere in her thoughts, but specifically elsewhere, somewhere she had chosen to be and was not choosing to share with him. He asked her once, directly, if something was wrong. She told him no, that she was tired, that the children had been difficult. He accepted this. He was a man who had learned to accept closed doors as boundaries rather than invitations, which is its own kind of failure of intimacy, but it was his particular failure, and it had its own history. He began, without fully acknowledging to himself what he was doing, to pay attention differently. To the timing of her returns from the church, to the frequency of her visits, which had increased beyond what seemed to him proportionate to simple religious observance, to the quality of her distraction in the evenings, which had a character he had learned, in his professional life, to associate with concealment. He followed her on a Thursday afternoon in September. He parked down the street from St. Mary's and waited. He watched Emily's car pull into the lot. He waited 20 minutes, then walked to the church through the side entrance, the one that opened near the sacristy, which he knew from years of attending Christmas services with his family. He moved through the building quietly. He was a man trained in the movement of spaces, in the reduction of his own presence. He had done things professionally that required exactly this set of skills. He found them in the nave of the church, near the altar. Imagine standing in the place where you took the most sacred vow of your life. The marble floor, the soaring ceiling, the great crucifix presiding over everything from the wall behind the altar. The specific smell of that place, candles, old stone, the persistent trace of incense. The stained glass throwing its colored light across the floor in long cathedral patterns. And in the center of all of it, your wife, and the man who has been holding himself up to her as the representative of everything holy. John Hargrove was not a man given to uncontrolled emotion. 9 years of marriage to a man of his temperament had given Emily a clear sense of the distance between his ordinary self and the person he became when something reached the deep place in him that his training had never quite contained. She had seen it very rarely. She saw it now. He came out from behind the altar. What happened in the next minutes has been reconstructed through Emily's testimony, through the forensic evidence, and through the investigation that followed. John confronted Father Mark directly. He was not shouting. Emily would later say that the absence of shouting was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. He was very still and very controlled, and he told the priest exactly what he had seen and exactly what he intended to do about it. Father Mark had one thing that John Hargrove did not. He knew what was in the basement. He knew what the investigation that John was threatening to initiate would uncover. He knew that the stakes of this confrontation were not simply the exposure of the affair or the end of his position at St. Mary's. They were the end of everything: his freedom, his safety, the entire constructed identity he had maintained across 4 parishes and 2 decades of predation. There is a large crucifix on the wall behind the altar at St. Mary's. It is bronze, mounted on a heavy wooden backing, the kind of sacred object that has been in a church long enough to become invisible through familiarity, present at every baptism, every wedding, every funeral the community has conducted, so constant that it stops being seen and simply becomes part of the architecture of the sacred space. Father Mark took it from the wall. The forensic examination of what happened on that altar would be thorough and specific, and would produce findings that the lead detective on the case later described with the careful professional language of someone who has learned to speak about unbearable things without being consumed by them, as among the most disturbing he had encountered in 20 years of homicide work. John Hargrove had been a trained fighter, a decorated Marine, a man in good physical condition. None of that was sufficient. The element of surprise, the weight of the object, the particular violence of a man who understood with complete clarity that his only alternative to this act was a life sentence, all of it combined into something that was over before it could be stopped. Emily Hargrove was in that church. She was present for all of it. She has not spoken publicly about what she witnessed. The victim's impact statement she submitted at trial was read by the prosecutor at her request, because she was unable to read it herself. Father Mark left through the side door of the church. He left Emily Hargrove kneeling on the altar floor. He left the crucifix where it had fallen. He left John Hargrove on the marble of the nave, in the colored light from the stained glass windows, in the place where the congregation would gather in 3 days for Sunday morning mass. He ran. Detective Sarah Miller had been with the County Homicide Unit for 11 years when the call came in from St. Mary's. She arrived to a scene that required her to set aside, as she later described it, every instinct that wanted to interpret what she was seeing symbolically. The location, the object, the specific terrible irony of the setting. And focus on the mechanics, the evidence, the sequence of events. She was methodical, and she was excellent at her work. And she was also human, which meant that what she found in St. Mary's Church on that September evening affected her in ways that evidence from crime scenes in neutral locations did not. The body of David Marsh was found in the basement during the sweep of the building that followed. The forensic examination connected his death to the fall from the bell tower. The diocese was contacted. The history of Father Mark's transfers began to emerge. 3 previous parishes, a pattern of behavior that had been managed institutionally and concealed from civil authorities. A file that the bishop's office had maintained with full awareness of its contents. Father Mark was 3 counties away and moving when the search began. He had cash, how much was never fully established, and a car that had not been immediately connected to him. The manhunt lasted 9 days. It involved state police, county sheriffs, and a ground search through a significant area of woodland that he had apparently entered on foot when his car was found abandoned at a rest stop off the interstate. Detective Miller coordinated the search from a command post set up at the edge of the state forest. She had read everything available on Father Mark by the second day: the previous complaints, the transferred files, the statements that Emily Hargrove gave in the immediate aftermath of her husband's death. She understood what kind of person she was looking for, which is to say, she understood that the version of him that the congregation of St. Mary's had known was a construction, and that the actual person would behave, under the pressure of pursuit, in ways that the construction never would. He was found on the 9th day, at the base of a rocky outcropping in the northeastern section of the state forest, approximately 40 miles from St. Mary's. He had made an attempt, the night before his capture, to take his own life, which had not been successful, and which had left him in a condition that required immediate medical attention. He was transported under guard. He received treatment. He survived. The trial was not brief, and it was not simple. His defense team attempted several approaches that the evidence, ultimately, was too comprehensive to support. The forensic connections were established clearly. Emily Hargrove's testimony, given over the course of 2 days that observers described as devastating in their specificity, was not effectively challenged. The files from the previous diocese, obtained through court order over the objection of church attorneys, established the pattern in terms that the jury found unambiguous. Father Mark was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and a range of additional charges arising from his conduct across the parishes where he had served. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has filed appeals. Each has been denied. The diocese settled civil claims brought by Emily Hargrove and by the families of his victims in the previous parishes, including the family of a woman in Ohio who had come forward during the trial with an account of what she had experienced under his spiritual counseling 8 years earlier. The terms of the settlement were not disclosed. They are understood to be significant. Emily Hargrove has 2 children who are now old enough to understand that their father is gone and their mother's life was altered irrevocably by events that took place inside a building she had turned to for comfort. What she has told them about those events, and how she has managed to continue building a life for them and for herself in the years since, is not something that belongs to this story. It belongs to her. I want to say something before I leave you with this. The institution that Father Mark operated within failed every person he harmed. The first complaint against him, in the first parish, was handled administratively. The second and third followed the same pattern. At each stage, the people with the authority to stop him made the institutional choice instead of the human one. They protected the church's image. They moved the problem. They handed him each time a new congregation, new people who had no idea what they were opening themselves to when they walked through those doors. This is not a story about religion. It is a story about institutions and accountability and the specific compounding harm that occurs when the people who have the power to intervene look at the cost of intervention and decide it is too high. Father Mark killed 2 people, but the chain of decisions that gave him access to St. Mary's, and to Emily Hargrove, and to the bell tower, and to the altar, involved more than one person. And those people are not the ones sitting in prison. Faith, in its genuine form, is one of the most profound things a human being can experience. The need to be witnessed, to bring your heaviest things to a place larger than your daily life and set them down. That need is real, and it is human, and there is nothing naive about it. What happened at St. Mary's was not a failure of faith. It was a failure of the human beings who were trusted to protect those who came to that place in their most open and vulnerable condition. The light still comes through the windows of St. Mary's in the same way it always has. The same quality, colored and gentle and different from ordinary light. Some of the congregation returned after the trial. Some did not. Both responses make complete sense. Both are, in their own way, an attempt to reckon with the fact that a place can hold beauty and horror simultaneously. That the same walls that sheltered genuine comfort also sheltered something that destroyed lives, and that the difficulty of holding both of those things at once is something that does not have a clean resolution. It just has to be held. Be careful who you trust with your most open moments. Be careful not of faith, but of the human beings who position themselves as its gatekeepers. The door should lead to something safe. It does not always.